Hi, everyone. This is the third video I'm making you for our week of asynchronous kind of connection and getting started in the room and class together. And the intention of this video is to introduce you to some of the definitions I'm using, and that sometimes I use, I think, interchangeably in ways that are both helpful and unhelpful. So part of my goal here is to preemptively define some of these and notice where they get kind of mixed up and interchange, but also they so often overlap and build up on each other. So it makes sense why we throw a word out there, but we mean something else. The intent of this is not to get rigid or say there's one right way to define these terms. Quite the opposite. This is meant to more create shared definitions and some more clarity, kind of unteasing different threads that we will be pulling on at different times in the class, and just to kind of alert you to that piece of our work together. Much of what I'm going to show you is from the work of a couple different organizations. One is called Impact Justice. Another one is Spring Up. And the third is the Chat Project. All three of these are oriented to transformative and restorative justice approaches to dealing with conflict, harm, and abuse. So they're informing, and some of these things are directly taken from the resources that they share and have created. So gratitude and credit due to the work of those organizations and what they share. So let's get started. What I love about Impact Justice, and then Spring Up did this as well, is that they use a concrete metaphor through these different definitions to help us understand some of the distinctions. So we will talk a lot about conflict and disagreement. Now, one way that they name a disagreement is a disagreement. It could be something as simple as disagreeing about the different kinds of pizza toppings that are best. It just represents I have a difference, like a disagreement or a difference of opinion about some quality of something in community with you. And then it shifts into a kind of conflict when there's also like opposing wants and needs, potentially very deeply rooted, or opposing interests or values and directions that then make the disagreement a more kind of substantial experience between the two of us. So, for example, a collaborative kind of disagreement conflict situation might be that we disagree about the kinds of types of pizza that are best, but we want to eat together. We need to order food, and we only have a certain amount in our budget. And so we're probably going to have to compromise with each other. So we have a need, kind of indisputable need to nourish ourselves. We have a need to be considered by each other. We have a need to collaborate. We have a certain amount of resources. And then we have preferences. We have a disagreement about the preferences of the things that are best within those certain circumstances. And so there we are in a kind of collaborative disagreement. Now, a conflict might be that if we couldn't actually compromise, or there was something going on between us that made that hard, it could kind of like escalate or increase something. However, I want to normalize conflict, not as a like abnormal escalation of people who can't deal with things, but as like a really normal part of life. We are constantly navigating disagreements and conflicts about what we need and what we want and what we value and the directions we want to take. And then we're kind of bringing in information, and we're working in relationship with each other to kind of move through what seems oppositional. This is the magic of conflict transformation, is the kind of symbolic or real experience of an experience of opposition in which there's a feeling like needs can't get met yet, and into a collaborative experience of revelation of like, oh, we have these needs and these preferences and these power dynamics, and we in collaboration with each other with a sense of mutual regard or curiosity, there's something that can happen in the relationship itself with each other that could actually turn that from a feeling of opposition into how do we make sure that both of us get fed together? What's the process by which we both get fed? How do we make sure we're both nourished given the different limitations, power dynamics, needs, preferences, values that are among us? And the orientation makes conflict transformational. If conflict is constantly perceived of as a kind of self-sacrificing zero-sum experience, or like I've gotten into a conflict, therefore I'm bad and wrong, and I just need to give the other person what they want, which some of us have learned to kind of like lie down in the face of a conflict. If we see the presence of conflict as, ooh, there's something here that looks stuck, but is actually inviting us into creativity to nourish life, then we get a chance for conflict transformation. Now, a next kind of word is hurt. And I'm going to distinguish the word hurt from the word harm. And this definition is coming from Spring Up. So the nuance of hurt is it's kind of like an activation of pain or an activation of previous harm, but we're distinguishing it slightly from harm in a way that I hope is useful. I've found this useful. The example that Spring Up gives is if I've got like a wound or a bruise or a cut and you brush up against it, you didn't actually make the cut or the bruise, but you activated it. I'm hurting. And I wasn't quite hurting before. There was a tenderness there, and then you like bumped up against it, and now I'm hurting. And it's not all your fault, but there's something you need to know or understand, and we need to understand about each other. There's something that matters about the activation. So the activation should not be made little, like, oh, well, I didn't cause that cut, but it also isn't to be made totally big, like, you never brush up against me again, you horrible human being. There's something, though, that's wise, that's like asking us to notice. Hurt asks us to notice something. Hurt matters. If I knew you had the open wound and then I was like, well, I really want to win X, Y, or Z. So I'm just going to like, I know I can bump up against that. And I know I'll have some power and control in the situation. Then I've moved into an act of harm, which is an act of using my power to exert some kind of influence and control at some level. Or that's more abuse, to actually create kind of an unmet need and a responsibility on my end to tend our relationship. In pizza terms, and this is my attempt at a pizza example. Let's say I had a previous friendship in which actually food was incredibly contentious. We had a really hard time making decisions about going out to eat with each other. We constantly felt it was always like a debate or a struggle, or maybe it was like that inner friendship or relationship. And therefore, in my new relationship or friendship, I kind of come pre-activated. So you say, what should we eat? I really want to do this. I really want to have this. God, that would be great. And you've brushed up against something of mine. You didn't even realize it. That completely activates me as we are even discussing our options. And of course, we know how that can escalate. Maybe I have a reaction that is feeling really hurt. And then you're feeling defensive that I'm feeling so hurt. And now I'm really hurt that you're feeling so defensive. And we've kind of escalated a situation. What I appreciate about Spring Up's distinction here is that sussing out if something's like the brush up against or the kind of like intentional thing is not about validity of pain. It's about degree of responsibility. But the assessing of the degree of responsibility is for the hurt person to do for themselves, rather than a defense tactic of the person who did the brushing up or the poking about, whether or not it's valid or not pain. So assessing our hurts, this is kind of like the core self-awareness, self-tending piece of conflict transformation work. Knowing the landscape of my pain, where I have tenderness, where I am calloused, where I'm sharp, where I'm tender, that's actually for me to do, for me to work on. And then in my relationships, my intimate relationship, my family, my close friendships, I get very real with people about, okay, well, that's where I'm very pokey. I've got cactus right there. Or actually, that's where I am so tender, you brush up against it and I get overly overwhelmed. I share with people my contours of hurt, not to put it all on them, to never brush up against them, but to create a field of awareness and kind of mutual responsibility for us to stay in relationship with each other towards the kind of world or relationship we are hoping for or articulating our shared kind of mission with one another. So hurt is a personal, it's like a personal assessment that's not intended for someone to be like, well, that's just hurt. That's not harm. Um, that being said, saying something hurts or that something is harmful doesn't automatically require the person who caused the hurt or the harm or who brushed up against it to do whatever is being demanded of them or asked of them. And so I also want to be careful here that hurt is the responsibility of the person who's experiencing the hurt to suss out, wow, when you did that, I have this wave of emotion, I have this body memory, I have this story, I have this internal work to do. Damn it, I don't want to do more internal work. I've had to do so much internal work, and I'm here. I'm trying to be in a relationship with you. It doesn't automatically, so this is a piece of somehow some of the ways we think survivor-centered or impacted person-centered means doing whatever is asked of a person who's been impacted. And as someone who works in domestic violence, I want to say that's actually not what we talk about in restorative justice and transformative justice. Impacted people, those of us who get impacted by a hurt or harm, get to name and define the contours of what is impacting us. And then in relationship and in community, say these are the things that are needed to make it right. But then we're actually dealing with other people's limitations, capacities, willingness to try to make it right together. So I want to, if you're reacting to any of these words to say, oh, I'm hurt, therefore I get to tell you what to do, that's not what we're saying. We're looking at the ways that what it means to hurt or what it means to harm so that we can explore the contours of shared responsibility to make it, to tending it, to making it right, to transforming the structures that cause it, not to assign blame. This is the trick here. Hurt and harm does not equal, okay, now we get to assign blame. Hurt and harm says, oh, now we get to pay attention. Something's being asked of us. To that point, harm. So this is like a set of actions by a person or a people or by systems, not just by individuals, but by structures and systems, stories, resources that have a negative impact on a person or a people that is creating unmet needs and obligations. So this is where we'll move to an example of the pizza thing. I know you have your dietary needs do not allow you to eat shrimp. This is the example Spring Up uses. I know you can't eat shrimp, and yet I really like shrimp. And so can't you just pick it off? And I consistently order shrimp and you can't actually eat it. And maybe there's a reason why I feel perfectly fine constantly ordering a food and thinking that you should kind of, like dance around the need here. Maybe it's because I'm the one with the money, or maybe it's the one in a ministerial situation. Oh, I'm the one with the church credit card, so I'm just going to order the food. I'll just keep forgetting. It's so hard to remember what you need. So there's also some level of power at play. Now, power is not simple. At all times, there are complicated, contradictory, and multiple power differences. So it's not as simple as we can like stack up each other's power perfectly in every given circumstance. It's that power is morphing contextually. So in a given circumstance, I might have more power to make a decision that would cause harm. And then if we change the context, you might have a different kind of power to cause some impact. And then overall, there might be a way that I move through more spaces than you where I consistently have more power. Or when it comes to limiting your choices, there I have the power or not. So it's not as simple as this person always has the power and this one does not. Power is in motion. It's in motion. It's in the meaning we're making. It's in the contexts we're in. It's in the dominant culture and in the subcultures we create. So it's not about cleaning up power perfectly. It's about being people who can notice the contours of how power is happening in a given relationship, situation, or context. and then be like, ooh, power is present. It's always present. How do we want to negotiate it together towards the kind of world and relationships that we want? How do we navigate equitably and consensually what's happening between us in this situation with the knowledge that both of us have needs, wants, values, purposes, and preferences, and power is at play? Where we move into like a word about abuse, it's then we're talking about a pattern of behaviors repeated over time. So a pattern of me making decisions or moving socially or emotionally or physically or politically in a space that continually exerts power over you or another person. And as harm accumulates as abuse happens. So it just kind of like keeps adding up in a situation. One way, this feels kind of like an anecdote, but I want to share it with you because I think it's helpful. In restorative justice approaches to domestic and family violence work, one thing we ask people is to help you understand in a given context or relationship, ask yourself who sets the weather in the relationship dynamic. Who sets the weather? And this phrase of who sets the weather has been really helpful to me in being with families who are experiencing abuse and harm with one another, often in situations where they are significantly impacted by systems of harm. So let's say a family in which the one parent is undocumented, the other one is working, and there is either sexual or physical violence going on between them. So you have multiple layers of harm happening, imprinting themselves on this family, while at the same time, a dynamic between the family members that is creating hurts, harms, and abuses. And the power in between them can be very complicated. And in one circumstance, a family member might set the weather in a dynamic. And then in another circumstance, the other one might set the weather of the dynamic. And at the same time, because of economic or citizenship related or gender related or family related factors, there's one person of the couple that might actually control the finances, whereas the other person has the citizenship. So power gets complicated fast. And abuse is not always the unidirectional abuse dynamic. These things are actually way more complicated. So rather than the framework might be for some of us, we're kind of constantly coming to conflicted or harmful dynamics, looking for who's the victim and who's the perpetrator. And I would just invite us as we're learning these languages to just soften the gaze a little over finding out who's the bad one and who's the good one, kind of like who's innocent and who's guilty, and let it be a little more murky in relationships, but also in systems, and then in larger cultural and dominant structures. That is not to say, I want to be very clear, that an individual can exercise incredible amounts of control and harm in a relationship dynamic over another person. And that by having a softer gaze over the dynamic, we are somehow saying that they don't have relationship obligations that they are responsible for tending. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying that some of the ways we've been trained in dominant culture is to find the binary and then try to prove it or stick with it or only focus on it. And if we're saying the goal is transformation in relatedness, in complicated entanglement with the world for the dignity of all life, then we're not served by the hyper focus on finding who is bad and who is good. We are more often served by noticing the patterns, dynamics, needs, and obligations that are occurring between people as they try to meet their needs as living beings on the planet in their relationships with one another. We're going to explore a lot the phrase healing and accountability. I'm going to use it a lot. The only thing I want to say about this now, before I'm not going to define how I define these two words today, is that both of these words carry like huge backpacks of interpretation and meaning for the people who hear them. Some people have such a strong reaction to the word healing, such a strong in both directions. Like, do not even talk to me about healing. I don't even want to hear about it. All the way to healing. I love healing. Like, healing is my message and my mission and my ministry. So I just want to say that the classroom is a space where you can be on both sides of that when it comes to this word healing. And we'll take time in the process of our course to play with that word. I would even say in organizations that have healing in the mission statement, I've sat in circles where all of the facilitators have different definitions about what the hell healing means, and their own almost traumatic like reactivity to having been told what healing is, and healing looks like this, or healing is soft, or healing is not hard or revengeful, or healing is you can complete your healing and healing ends in forgiveness and blah blah blah. No, just like drop it. I would invite you to just actually get real with yourself about what you think healing means for you, not even to try to define it for other people, but turn it really inward on yourself. And when you have actually genuinely experienced something that for you feels like healing, what were some of the qualities or body sensations that were present for you when that happened? And what actually made it possible? So hold that as your personal definition. We're not going to create a collective definition of healing. We're going to actually lean into the idea that there's something about healing that includes people's agency to define what healing is for themselves. There's a quality of healing that is choiceful for the people who are cultivating it, nourishing it, exploring its contours, whatnot. Accountability is similarly a backpack full of people's reactions. More often than not, a more punitive understanding of being held to account for something. What we're going to experience in this course is a turning of the word accountability. There's going to be a whole day, I think there's a whole class where we watch actually some videos and read some work from people who think about accountability a lot. And the restorative practices movements, the transformative justice movements are clear about this. Accountability at its best is humanizing and liberating. And if me telling you that accountability can be humanizing and liberating sounds far-fetched for you, then I would hold like some loving curiosity about what's in your backpack around what you think accountability means or should mean. But we're gonna explore that together. We're gonna knead the dough and see what we think we mean by that. When it comes to how we use language in our class and do learning in our class, I think the big takeaways from looking at any of the language is we're really trying to orient ourselves to what it means to be related versus orienting to being right. So whenever you notice that feeling, for me, that's a similar orientation to finding out who the good person is and who the bad person is in a relationship, and like wanting to assign the blame somewhere. To me, that feels similar to finding out what's the right, like who's the right thing, who's doing the right thing, who's doing the wrong thing. And I might just invite a sense of like, actually, if we are responsible or responsive to a web of relationships, how do we orient to the relational obligations, tenderness, cares, needs in the relatedness, rather than orienting to the assigning of good and bad, who was right and who was wrong, including for ourselves. It is so easy, especially in spaces where we're learning new language and from transformative justice or restorative justice, to use the very language that is about moving away from a punitive stance, meaning assigning blame and offering punishment. It's so easy to use that very language to somehow still assign blame and give punishment to each other. And Spring Up highlights this in some of their work around our tendency to use language intended for liberation and offering a different paradigm around how we are with each other with harm, hurt, and conflict, and to use the very tools to actually still do the thing, still find a way to tell you that you're actually bad and wrong, and I get to decide the punishment of you, or that I'm clean and clear and bright and right and innocent and you're the problem, I'm not the problem. I would just invite us to notice anytime in our own bodies when we are hungry to be right about something. And shift into like, how do I be in relationship with you? I get curious about the space between us rather than the assigning of distinction kind of over our heads. So I don't want to orient to the distinction between the two of us as much as I want to explore the relatedness between us and the needs present. If in our course together, you notice yourself feeling kind of like, whoa, like I'm kind of feeling either hurt or I'm actually feeling harm. I'm feeling activated around something that doesn't feel connected here. The first thing we're always going to practice is, if you can, notice responsibly for yourself first as you're feeling it, what you're actually feeling and needing, which is about getting clear about your needs, your discomforts, your curiosities, and even your own grief. And to take the time to notice for yourself what you're feeling, which isn't to say you shut up and be quiet until you have it figured out. I don't actually mean that. But I mean that to actually either request the time or that we value the time it takes to actually process what's going on for each of us. There's another way that, now that we're so clear about the ways we can hurt and harm each other, kind of sometimes a culture where we call on or call out the harm, and then we're like, we need to deal with this right now. We need to feel like it's resolved and wrapped up and that we've handled it and moved on. Is it also somewhat similar to a kind of assigning rightness, wrongness, blame, and punishment paradigm? More often, and I think this language comes from Spring Up, we actually have to get comfortable with incompleteness. There's like a certain growing our capacity to deal with what's not always satisfying or wrapped up or complete, but what's being noticed and given attention to instead, and then made space for. So if you're ever feeling something in our course or in our dynamic, please, my first request is just to ask for support directly if you need it. And also, if something happens in the class, I invite us to actually notice that something's happened and then be curious about the space it needs for it to kind of be and settled in our bodies. And we'll talk more about that together. We'll walk through something about that. All of that work is about de-escalation. So we feel a hurt or harm. We might go into a stress response, a survival response that's about the moment, or that's about the past, or it's about the big thing or the small thing. And when we get escalated, options become more limited and clarity becomes harder. We're learning the task of de-escalation as much as possible. The flare up, the feeling becomes noticeable. The wound is wise. But then there's something we have to learn together to do for ourselves and as facilitators of conflicted spaces, which is then to like bring the temperature to a temperature that people can be with each other in, to be in shared space, so that those people can actually make choices or feel into it more fully or more clearly or feel creative. And that's a different speed than like a judicial system in which something happens and it's going to get handled this way. It's way more felt and experienced. So I'm inviting you to notice how you feel and to tend and take responsibility for how you feel. Let us notice it with you. Let us get curious about it. Let other people notice how they feel. And then to see how many options and spaces and choices we can make that allow us to be accountable in a way that is humanizing for the dignity of all. All right. That's your introduction of those words. Words which maybe we'll expand the definitions or contract the definitions of. And I look forward to seeing you soon.